This morning is read from the 9th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And Matthew got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. I recently heard the story of a man named Brian who grew up with an abusive alcoholic father who was disliked by everyone who knew him. Brian himself despised everything about his dad, but there was one thing about his dad that he didn't know what to do with. It was a fairly strange and yet in its own way a beautiful story that his dad used to tell every single Christmas. The story went like this. Once upon a time there was a little boy who was very poor. He lived with his younger siblings and with their mother, who was barely able to feed them. The boy's clothes were hand-me-downs. In fact, he couldn't ever remember a time when he had gotten any new clothes. He had only one toy, and that toy was a broken car that was every bit as old and beat up as the boy's clothes. The car's windows were all broken, the roof was smashed in, 2 of the wheels were missing on the car. But the boy absolutely loved that car. When he played, it could be anything he wanted it to be. It could be a taxi, it could be a police car, it could be an ambulance, it could be a race car, whatever he wanted. In fact, most of the boy's happiest childhood memories revolved around playing with that car. Well, Christmas was almost here, and the boy knew that there would once again be no presents, but that didn't matter. He was perfectly happy because, you see, this was the first year that he would be old enough to attend the midnight Mass on Christmas Eve. For years, he had heard about how wonderful the Christmas Eve Mass was, all of the sights and sounds and the music and the colors and the smells. But most of all, it was about the manger scene. Oh, the manger scene. He had been told that the manger scene was huge with figures of Mary and Joseph and with the wise men and with the shepherds. And it even had sheepdogs and other animals in the manger. And in the center of it all was this plaster baby Jesus who had a glorious halo around his head, and he lay in this manger with real straw. Before Mass began, it was traditional for people to lay gifts next to the child. Often the gifts were magnificent, shiny items or jeweled items for the altar, or they were new clothes for poor children, or sometimes even envelopes filled with money. By the time the service began, it looked like hundreds of caravans of wise men had been there. The gifts were piled so high, at least that's what the boy's friends had told him. They had seen it. The little boy wanted so much to give the Christ child a gift of his own, but what could he give? He had nothing. With only a handful of days left before Christmas, the boy decided that he would ask people he knew if he could do odd jobs for them so he could earn a little bit of money to maybe buy a gift for the Christ child. So he asked people, and sure enough, they said yes. And every day before and after school, he would work, and he would sweep floors, and he would wash windows, and he would do whatever it is that someone wanted him to do. Finally, the afternoon of Christmas Eve came. The boy sat down at the kitchen table, and he put his money on the table, and he began counting his money. He was sure that he had enough money to buy a nice gift. But before he could go out to buy something, his mother came home, and immediately she saw the money. "Oh, son, what a wonderful boy you are. What a wonderful son. Now we can go out and have a real Christmas dinner." And with that, the mother scooped up the money and she hurried off to buy food before the market closed. Well, the boy was heartbroken and he started crying. He went to his room and he tried his hardest not to be angry. When things like this happened, he had always been told you should offer it up to Jesus. But what did that mean? The words literally spun around and spun around and spun around in his head. Offer it up to Jesus. Offer it up to Jesus. Just then he looked and noticed the broken toy car on the dresser. That's it. It's the only thing left that I have to give. So late that night, when it came time to go to Mass, the little boy tucked the car into his pocket and he headed out the door. As it turned out, his mother had to stay home with the little kids who were not feeling well, so she said, "You can go to Mass by yourself." And he did. When he got to the church, he felt completely overwhelmed. Here he was, this little boy. There were so many big adults who were cramming into the Christmas Eve pews. Most of the people he didn't even know. Before he took his own seat, though, he did what he came to do. He walked up the center aisle. He genuflected as he had been taught. He turned to the manger scene, which had been set up to one side of the church. Sure enough, gifts were stacked high next to Jesus, just as his friends said they would be. Some of the gifts were wrapped, others were unwrapped. Some of the gifts looked, oh, so very expensive, but it didn't matter. The little boy was proud of his gift. So he stood before the manger and he gently and reverently laid his broken toy car next to all the treasures. Having done that, he squeezed into a pew several rows back from the front, and just then the organ began playing. The processional was about to begin, but before it happened, an usher came forward to take one last look to make sure everything was in place. When the usher saw the little boy's car, he reached down and blurted out loudly enough for half the congregation to hear, "Who would leave a piece of trash like this at the Lord's crib?" And with that, the usher leaned down, picked up the car, and threw it across the church. So it landed on its broken top and threw its wheels spinning. As the grand procession began, everyone stood. The boy was crying and upset. But he stood with everyone else, with so many adults in front of him and just a little guy, he couldn't see anything that was going on. All he could really see was the cross, the processional cross, moving forward. And it suddenly came to a stop. At first, he had no idea what was going on. He couldn't tell what was happening. He couldn't see, but then his face opened up and he could kind of peek between adults. To his absolute amazement, the baby in the manger somehow had come to life. And this baby was crawling across the stone floor toward his broken car. When the Christ child reached the car, he tucked it under his arm and he started crawling back to his manger again. Now the little boy's view was blocked by adults once again, and he couldn't see what happened next, but when everyone finally sat down, he could see perfectly. And there in the manger, just as before, the lifeless plaster baby Jesus with the bright halo was lying in the straw. And now his face had changed. He was smiling, and his arms were folded around a broken toy car. It's a beautiful story, right? Story told by a father to his son every Christmas. But as I said, it wasn't at all a happy story or a beautiful story for Brian because it was his abusive father's story. Brian always suspected that as he told that story, it was propaganda. Why can't you be like that little good boy in the story, was what Brian heard. I I was afraid and suspicious of my dad, Brian said many years later. Most of all, I hated the idea that the ogre who darkened my life would dare to tell me a Christmas story about Jesus being loving and forgiving, as if my father knew anything about being loving and forgiving. Well, years heal many wounds. Years certainly provide new perspectives. Abuse is a horrible, horrible, horrible thing, make no mistake about it, and forgiving an abuser is oftentimes just as hard. In his case, though, Brian was able to rise above the abuse. He ended up getting a PhD from Princeton. He taught college for many years, and he now is a very happily retired man living in Illinois. When interviewed, he said, "It's taken a long time, but I'm finally learning about forgiveness. I'm finally learning something about the words, 'Forgive us our sins, even as we forgive those who sin against us.'" Brian says the more that he reflects on his dad's Christmas story now, the more he wonders if it wasn't his dad's way of admitting that he was a lot like that smashed car with a dented roof and a couple of wheels missing. He certainly had made a wreck of his life, that's for sure. But maybe, just maybe, Brian's dad wanted desperately to be forgiven. At least that's what Brian hopes now. Maybe his dad didn't know how to ask. Maybe all along, his dad's story was his way of saying, "I want to be the one that the Christ child crawls to, takes home, and cradles in his arms. I want to be that one." Maybe Brian says, "My father just wanted or needed someone to assure him that Jesus is able and willing and eager to forgive even the worst of sinners." This weekend, the Christian church across the world is celebrating and remembering St. Matthew, the writer of the first gospel. We probably will never know why Matthew, who was by all accounts a very successful tax collector, we'll never know why he or how he just got up so suddenly to follow Jesus, to set out on this course that was so uncertain about everything except that it would turn his life so completely upside down. Why would Matthew say yes without ever asking a single question? Why would he just go and leave and give himself so totally to someone he didn't even know? Why? It just makes no sense. Then again, why would Jesus have any interest in a tax collector? Someone who was known in those days as being a cheat and a scoundrel. The religious leaders wondered that themselves. They even asked the question of the disciples, why does your master eat with sinners and tax collectors? In the words of the usher in Brian's father's story, who would leave a piece of trash like that at the Lord's crib? The answer is, maybe this is just who Jesus is. Always eating in the wrong house with the wrong people. Spending way too much of his time crawling across dirty floors to tuck yet another wrecked life under his arm. Listen again to the words of today's gospel. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me," and Matthew got up and followed. That's the story. That's the whole story. What's amazing about this is it's not a story told by somebody else. It's Matthew's own words. He wrote the gospel. So Jesus is telling his own story. It's like he's saying, I got up and followed. I don't know why. I just did. I didn't ask questions. I had no conditions. I had no hesitation. I just got up and followed. There's no way of explaining it other than just follow. When you think about it, it's a pretty remarkable story. Frederick Buechner is one of my favorite authors, and he has written this. Faith is a word that describes the direction our feet start moving when we find that we are loved. Is that what happened to Matthew that day long ago? His feet just started moving? Sure, he could have waited until he knew more. He probably should have waited until he at least felt more certain about what he was getting into. But then I suppose he'd have waited, if he had waited for answers that made any sense, he'd probably still be waiting. Again, the words of Frederick Beacon. Faith is stepping out into the unknown with nothing to guide us, but a hand just beyond our grasp. A hand that longs to touch all that is broken, a hand that reaches out to gather up lives, both those successful and those that some days feel more like worthless trash. Today we remember how Jesus chose Matthew to be a disciple. He could have waited. He could have asked a lot of questions. He could have objected. He could even have said no. So can we, I suppose. I want to end this morning by commending to you a prayer that is very special and meaningful to Jill and to me. We recite it to each other, remind each other of it quite often. It's a prayer that's attributed to Martin Luther. A very powerful prayer that goes like this. God, you have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the end, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us grace to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. May we all be bold enough, like Matthew, to say that prayer and mean it. Amen. Hymn number 700.